Well, good afternoon, everyone. I've spent a lot of time recently investigating the early years of the Oxfordian movement, the years just after John Thomas Looney introduced to the world the idea of Edward de Vere as Shakespeare. I found some interesting things that I want to tell you about today, things that I'll be reporting on in more detail in the coming year. Okay, the original 1920 edition of Shakespeare Identified, published by Cecil Palmer in London, went through at least two printings, distinguished by the gold or black lettering on the front of the cover and on the spine. The third image shown here is the dust jacket from that same edition. I've never found an image of it on the internet, so it could be that my actual paper copy is the only one left in existence.
I think I have one.
Okay. Okay, there's at least one more in existence. Okay, there's at least three. Okay, but I've never been able to find a copy of the dust jacket for the 1920 New York edition. So that might be completely gone. I don't know. If anyone finds one, please let me know. Okay, this slide shows the number of Oxfordian publications published each year, 1920 to 1945, inspired by Loney's book. The blue bars represent articles, and the orange are books. You can see, first, an explosion of interest in the idea here in 1920, just after Loney's book was published. But just a few years later, by the middle of the 1920s, interest, or at least publications available to the public, were down almost to zero. Then if we jump over here to 1937, right here, this sudden increase is due to the launching of the first Oxfordian publication, the newsletter of the Shakespeare Fellowship. So all of the previous articles that had appeared were in non-Oxfordian publications, like the Times of London or the Saturday Review. Then as we get into the 1940s, with World War II upsetting everything, the number of publications, again, drops down almost to zero. But let's jump back to the mid-1920s, again here, back where there are very few publications. During those lean years, hidden from view, a real Oxfordian community was forming, one that included Colonel Bernard R. Ward, Captain Bernard M. Ward, his son, Admiral Hubert Holland, Major Montague Douglas, and a dozen or so civilians. It was that community that was responsible for the resurrection of the Oxfordian idea, seen here in the later years of the 1920s and throughout the 1930s. The most active member of that community by far was Percy Allen, who was indefatigable in his efforts to promote the Oxfordian idea. And here's a picture of him here. In his most active years, the decade from 1929 to 1938, he was responsible for more than 38% of all Oxfordian publications. They were either books that he wrote, or articles he wrote, or reviews of his books, or letters he wrote to the editor in response to those reviews, or coverage of talks that he gave. In 2 years, 1930 and 1936, he was responsible for more than 50% of all Oxfordian publications. I might add that he died in a poorhouse because Oxfordian work apparently didn't pay very well back then. Now, I know of his publications only because I've spent most of the last 2 years making extensive efforts to track down early Oxfordian articles. I've obtained copies in PDF format and print format of more than 2,000 articles published in non-Oxfordian publications, not counting the ones in the Oxfordian publications, 1920 to 1984, prior to Charlton Ogburn's big book, including more than 850 articles from the 1920 to 1945 period. Now here's a picture of my working binders of those articles from the first 25 years of the Oxfordian movement. I might be the only person alive today who's read more than a few of those articles and letters to editors, because only a few of them have ever been reprinted anywhere. Now, here is one of those binders, the one in purple there, 1930 to 1936, has 354 Oxfordian articles from non-Oxfordian publications, Sounds like a lot, right? Well, if you divide it out by the 7 years, that comes to 1 article per week for the entire United Kingdom, United States, and Canada. So it's not very many articles at all, given the millions of pages of published in newspapers and periodicals. These are all unique articles, 354 during that 7-year period. Probably about 1 million to 1. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I've given information on all of these articles to Bill Boyle, who's added it to his SOAR database. He's also adding links to as many of the actual articles as he can, given copyright restrictions. Okay, with all this out of the way as background, for the rest of this presentation, I want to focus on the first year of the Oxfordian era, 1920 and 1921. So to return to Shakespeare Identified, the publisher, Cecil Palmer, actively promoted the book, placing ads for it in many newspapers and literary journals. Here's 2 of those ads. The first is an advertisement specifically for the book that appeared in the Times Literary Supplement, and here's an ad for a dozen of his books, including Shakespeare Identified, that appeared in the Bookman. Now here's an interesting advertisement for Loney's books. A full-page ad for Shakespeare Identified, the poems of Edward de Vere, and a book on Shakespeare by George Greenwood. It appeared at the back of this book, In the Clouds Above Baghdad, a military memoir from World War I. So you might ask, how did an ad for drama and poetry end up in the back of a military memoir? Well, the answer is that this book was published by Cecil Palmer. So he sought every opportunity he could to promote Loney's books. And he was successful. Shakespeare Identified was reviewed 42 times in 1920. Okay, we've seen some of what Cecil Palmer, the publisher, was doing to promote Shakespeare Identified. But what was the author himself doing? The traditional answer has been not very much, for 3 reasons. The first is Loney's own statements. He said on several occasions that the Shakespeare authorship question wasn't the most important issue facing mankind, and that after several years of intense work on the issue, he was turning his attention to those other, more important subjects. Second is Loney's retiring nature, which we know about because of articles about him in the Shakespeare Fellowship newsletter in the 1940s after he died. Loney was so retiring that he didn't even want to meet Ava Turner Clarke or Charles Wisner Burrell when they visited England in the 1930s. And he welcomed Sigmund Freud to England in the summer of 1939 only by letter and never met him in person. And third was Loney's actual publication record. Here's a list of Loney's publications as they've traditionally been known. You can see that following Shakespeare Identified, he published nothing for a year until his collection of the poems came out a year later, and then nothing for more than a year until 2 articles in 1922, and then nothing for another 13 years. So for all 3 reasons, it appears that Loney had indeed turned away from Oxfordian work after the publication of Shakespeare Identified. It appeared that he had done little, if anything, to promote it. Again, this was the traditional view for 7 decades, based on information from the 1940s onwards. It all seems a little disappointing. Here's the same list of publications as they were known for decades until a year and a half ago. Then, beginning in the middle of last year, 19 unknown, long-lost publications by John Thomas Looney have come to light. I've put spaces in the publication record where those newly discovered works fit in. And here's the same slide with the newly discovered works in blue and purple font. You can see that most of them, 15 out of the 19, fit into the 1920 and 1921 timeframe and are letters to the editors or essays that Loney wrote in response to reviews critical of his book. So we can now see that the earlier conclusion that Loney had turned away from the Oxfordian movement after the publication of his book was not correct. These newly discovered articles and letters reveal him to have been intensely engaged in defending himself and his ideas from the attacks in those reviews, and in further substantiating the validity of the Oxfordian claim. Finding these articles and letters greatly changed my opinion of Loney. I now see that the apparently mild-mannered John Thomas Looney was a fighter, mild-mannered on the outside perhaps, but with a spine of steel inside. These are examples of Loney's efforts to set the record straight, to respond to criticism of his book and his ideas. So his articles and letters in 1920 appeared in literary journals such as the Times Literary Supplement, right here. You can see that the review appeared on March 4th and Loney's letter and response appeared March 25th. They also appeared in newspapers such as the Yorkshire Post and Leeds Intelligencer, which was the largest newspaper in England at the time. It actually ran 3 reviews of Shakespeare Identified early in March. Loney responded on March 11th. The same day, a 4th review was published, and Loney responded to that on April 1st. And reviews also appeared in general public interest periodicals such as, someone keeps moving the button. The Saturday Review. The review appeared, Loney responded, and then the reviewer replied to Loney's review. And his letters appeared in the Bookmans Journal. The Bookmans Journal and Print Collector was one of a number of literary periodicals that flourished in London in the decade after the First World War. Although little known today, the Bookmans Journal ran more extensive coverage of the Oxfordian idea during 1920 and the first half of 1921 than any other publication. Its coverage included 5 letters written by Loney. Here you can see the banner at the top of one of the issues advertising the letter by Loney that appeared in it. Is Shakespeare identified? Mr. Loney's new clue. As important as the Bookmans Journal's coverage was, I almost missed it in my research. It's not included in any of the usual databases. Not ProQuest, not Gale, not British periodicals, not the online collection of the British Library. I stumbled across it only because it placed an ad in the Times Literary Supplement. Here's a picture of the ad, advertising a special issue, the May 21st, 1920 issue, that focused on Shakespeare's identity. If it wasn't for that ad right there, we wouldn't know anything today about 5 important letters written by John Thomas Looney. Now, here's a list of the Bookmans Journal's coverage of the Oxfordian idea in 12 of its issues over the course of a year and a half. The first issue to cover the subject was a review of Shakespeare Identified, followed 3 weeks later by a letter from Loney again, that issue also included excerpts from reviews of the book in 4 other periodicals. Then a month later, or a few weeks later, the reviewer's response to Loney's letter, then Loney responded to the reviewer, and then finally the special issue, which had been advertised in the Times Literary Supplement, and so on. So Loney's 5 letters, the most to appear in any one periodical, are uniquely important. They form a microcosm of all of his letters, and together with the other Oxfordian pieces in the Bookmans Journal, form a microcosm of the impact the Oxfordian idea had in the years immediately after it was first proposed. I've described those letters in the current issue of the Oxfordian, which has also reprinted the full text annotated of all 5 of those letters. So what I want to do now is highlight one set of the points that Loney made in his letters to the Bookmans Journal. Loney had no illusions about the severity of the test to which his ideas would be put. As he wrote, I was well aware that, in propounding a new theory of Shakespearean authorship, I was exposing myself to as severe an ordeal as any writer has been called upon to face, that the work would be rigorously overhauled in none too indulgent a spirit by men who know the subject in all its minutiae, and that, if the argument contained any fatal flaw, that would be detected immediately and the theory overthrown. Now let's examine in more detail what expectations Loney actually had for responses to his book. We'll look at the responses Loney expected, his surprise at the actual responses, his reaction to those responses, and the effect of those responses a year later. First, his expectations. Being a gentleman of the old school, Loney perhaps expected to engage in what has been called the great conversation that people of goodwill engage in as they seek to discover the truth of a subject. He had hoped, he stated, that English literary journals would throw open their columns to such a discussion as will let in the fullest light upon the question. He further hoped that his arguments will be most carefully weighed before readers precipitate themselves into debate upon the question. He had perhaps expected that critics would read his book before critiquing it, and that they would state his findings accurately before taking issue with them. So what he actually encountered was reviewers who hadn't read his book or hadn't read it carefully, and who attacked his weakest arguments while ignoring his strongest. He must have been caught by surprise by the hostility exhibited by so many reviewers and readers. The editor of the Bookmans Journal informs us that Mr. Loney's book was extensively reviewed and provoked in nearly every case hostile criticism. Loney himself observed that certain sections of the Orthodox in America have assailed my work with a hostility quite equal to what it has aroused in England. He must have been taken aback by attacks that weren't at all in line with what he called the spirit of impartiality and truth by which any problem can be solved. The personal nature of the attacks must also have been a surprise. Robertson, for example, charged him with prepossession, that is, with having had the idea of authorship by the nobleman Edward de Vere in mind from the very beginning, and then setting out to find evidence to support it, a charge that directly challenged the veracity of Loney's description in Shakespeare Identified of his actual method of investigation. In short, Robertson called him a liar. In the face of such hostility, Loney must have believed he had no choice but to respond. However distasteful the matter, he wrote, no real man can ignore a challenge of this nature from whatever source it may come. And so he met the challenge head on by writing 15 letters to editors challenging the accuracy or fairness of their reviews. Beyond merely defending himself and his ideas, Loney turned the tables on many of his critics, using their own evidence against them. He pointed out, for instance, that given the stoppage of the publication of Shakespeare's plays in 1604, the year Oxford died, it is not too much to claim that the date of Oxford's death, instead of being a weakness, is one of the strongest links in the chain of evidence. The results. His critics laid a few gloves on him, and he was a bit bloodied, but he was still standing at the end of the day. A year after publication of Shakespeare Identified, he was able to write that the ordeal has been passed through. I have watched anxiously every criticism and suggestion that has been made, and what is the result? Not a single really formidable or destructive objection to the theory has put in an appearance. He even found, he noted, that some critics and reviewers who have made themselves most intimate with the many-sidedness of the evidence have confessed themselves most impressed and almost persuaded, sometimes apparently against their evident wish. At the same time, looking back over the years since Shakespeare Identified had been published, Loney was not optimistic about the future of British intellectual life. The attacks on the Oxfordian idea did not, he felt, reflect well on the intellectual credit of England. The present-day handling by the intellectual classes of all problems requiring thought rather than erudition and literary style, he wrote, gave him an uneasy feeling that the initiative which England held in the latter half of the 19th century was passing into other hands. Well, I'll be reading that anyways. We now turn to an interesting topic, that of two important issues that Loney didn't address in Shakespeare Identified or in responses to his critics. One is the issue of how Oxford's authorship could have been hidden. How could such a vast undertaking possibly have succeeded? Loney says he doesn't need to address that question in order to prove Oxford's authorship. The second issue concerns why Oxford hid his authorship. Loney notes Oxford's feelings of shame and his references to a vulgar scandal and to the disrepute into which his name had fallen as reasons for hiding his authorship. But he doesn't probe further to identify what actions or circumstances resulted in that shame, vulgar scandal, or disrepute. Loney said he didn't need to answer that question either to prove Oxford's authorship. So he backed away from asking what events could possibly have been so momentous as to push Oxford to hide his authorship and to force others in the know to go along with the deception. Loney may have been right that he didn't need to answer those questions, but later generations of Oxfordians, including ourselves, can't leave such important questions unanswered. We must seek explanations for such crucial questions in order to understand what happened and how and why. Let's try for a moment to understand why Loney turned away from these questions. He's given us several clues. Let's put them together and see where they lead. Let's see what they reveal about his thinking. Clue number 1, Oxford's attitude toward women. Loney suspected that the answer to those two questions had something to do with Oxford's attitude toward women. His statement on this point is so important that I will read the entire paragraph. The capacity for intense affection combined with weakness of faith, which is one of the peculiarities of Shakespeare's mind, has not, so far as we are aware, so close a parallel anywhere in literature as in the poems of Edward de Vere. It is not merely in an occasional line, but is the keynote of much of his poetry. Indeed, we may say that it probably lies at the root of a great part of the misfortune and mystery in which his life was involved, and may indeed afford an explanation for the very existence of the Shakespeare mystery. Clue number 2, the way Loney treated the bed trick in Shakespeare Identified. Loney introduces what he calls the most remarkable piece of evidence met with in the whole course of his investigations, but then adds that we would willingly be spared the penning of such matter. Its importance as evidence does not, however, permit of this. Well, we want to ask, why would Loney not want to report the most remarkable piece of evidence met with in the whole course of his investigations? Because the answer is, the piece of evidence has to do with the essential plot element in All's Well That Ends Well, which Loney describes as the entrapping of Bertram into marital relations with his own wife in order that she might bear him a child unknown to himself. The evidence Loney discovered was that a similar event occurred in the life of Edward de Vere. The passage he discovered states that he, Oxford, forsook his lady's bed, but the father of Lady Anne by stratagem contrived that her husband should unknowingly sleep with her, believing her to be another woman, and she bore a son to him in consequence of this meeting. Elsewhere in one of the other of Loney's publications that I discovered that probably nobody else alive today is aware of or has read, Loney twice refers to this incident in Oxford's life as revolting. Clue number 3 comes from Loney's comments about his 1922 article in the Golden Hind. The Golden Hind was a literary magazine that ran poems, stories, and criticism, and artistic drawings. In a letter to Ava Turner Clark in 1926, Loney describes this article as containing his most important findings since Shakespeare Identified was published. And yet, he adds, unfortunately, the art section of the magazine turned out to be such as I did not approve of, and so I have been prevented from broadcasting the article. In other words, Loney was so mortified or so aghast at seeing drawings of nudes on the pages of his article that he felt he couldn't tell anybody about it. So, putting these 3 clues together, we see that Loney was a real Victorian, unable to go down the path towards solving the mystery of why and how Oxford hid his authorship because he could not bring himself to address sexual topics in a public forum. Having been born in 1870, he was 30 or 31 when Queen Elizabeth died and the Victorian era ended, and he apparently remained circumspect about public discussions of intimate matters throughout his life. And so we, the Oxfordian community today, are left with the task of filling in the blanks, of writing the rest of the story. It is these questions of why and how, which arose in the earliest days of the Oxfordian movement and which Loney didn't address, that are still bedeviling the Oxfordian community today. All right, moving on. Whoever thinks Loney didn't have a sense of humor hasn't read Shakespeare Identified closely enough. There's a dozen or so places where his dry, wry sense of humor comes through. Here's 3 of them. First, the green one. After discussing the order of the initials WH in the dedication to the sonnets, Loney turns to those of the publisher, Thomas Thorpe, and writes, "Fortunately, the question is not likely to arise as to whether these initials are in their original or transposed order." You got to read this carefully, or these things just go right by you. Okay, the blue passage. Regarding Judge Thomas E. Webb's effort to present Bacon rather than Oxford as the logical person to have written the marriage sonnets, Loney writes, "His Honor's Baconian leanings had evidently disturbed his judicial balance." Would anyone else have phrased it that way? I don't think so. Loney was a very unique writer. And now the red one, about the idea that the shakiness of Shakespeare's signatures in his will was due to paralysis, Loney comments, "Though he managed to produce some kind of signature whilst afflicted with paralysis, he seems to have produced none at all without the affliction." Paralysis had evidently been good for him. So you're not going to pull one by Loney. If you try to have some shaky logic, he's going to catch you on it. Now let's ask a question. What was the man John Thomas Looney like? Let's try an experiment using the Loney method. Now that we have 28 Oxfordian publications by Loney, let's pretend we don't know who wrote them and try to determine from the works themselves the qualities that the author must have had to be able to write them. So, what qualities jump out at us from Loney's works? I mean, from the works of someone whose the author is unknown? He had to have been an independent thinker to doubt the official story, and a logical thinker to come up with the process he used to ferret out the identity of the true author. He had to have been determined. It took him years of effort to not to find Edward de Vere's name, but to document his authorship. And he had to have great self-control to hold on to his discovery until the moment was right to release it to the world after the World War had ended. He was modest, not thinking he had all the answers, because he pointed out a score of times in Shakespeare identified areas where further research was needed. He was a unique literary stylist, as anyone who's read his writings knows. He had a dry sense of humor, as we've just seen. He was circumspect on the subject of sexual relations. He was a real Victorian or Edwardian. And he was a poor proofreader and not careful in his attributions. This point needs further explanation. Here are some examples of how Loney really wasn't careful about details. He refers to someone he calls Richard Bagehot when he means Walter Bagehot, one of the most famous intellectuals in the past half century. He refers repeatedly to Dean Church when he means Richard William Church. He refers to a book called The Cecil Family when the real title is The House of Cecil. Same thing with the Spencer example. And I like the last one. He refers to a book called Shakespeare's Penmanship when the real title is Shakespeare's Handwriting. So he remembered, the gist of the titles, but not the details, and he didn't go back to double check them. Yeah, right. Yeah, his internet was down that day. Yeah, but still, if you took accurate notes, you would have the information in front of you. In Shakespeare Identified, Loney quoted 240 passages from other works, and he frequently made mistakes in the passages themselves or in his attributions. Here's a typical example, a short passage quoted in Shakespeare Identified from the New Valorium Shakespeare's edition of King Lear. It's a passage by the editor, Horace Howard Furness, but when Loney quotes the passage, the part in blue, he only paraphrases the passage even though he puts it into quotation marks. That's mistake number one. The orange text Loney attributes to Drake, but it's really Furness's commentary. That's mistake number two. And the word be should be remain, as in I think we must remain content. Mistake number three. So here you see Loney made three mistakes in one short quoted passage. He was apparently as careless about small details as he was brilliant in discovering Oxford's authorship. To continue with the last two items down here, courageous and retiring, Loney had two contradictory qualities to a high degree. He contained multitudes. On one hand, he was courageous, not backing away from a fight even when he knew himself to be horrendously outnumbered by critics of his book and his ideas. At the same time, he was retiring, preferring to remain in what could almost be termed seclusion. I've already mentioned that he didn't meet Charles Wisner Burrell or Ava Turner Clarke or even Sigmund Freud, preferring to communicate with them by letter. So, given all that we know about John Thomas Looney, I think we can say, as an early reviewer did, that it's impossible not to like Mr. Looney. I think I showed this quote in my presentation last year, but it's worth looking at again, isn't it? You can see the quote comes from the very first sentence of the review. It is impossible not to like and even to admire Mr. Looney. So this was one of the fairest and most objective reviews of the book that appeared in that first year. Now I want to leave you with an unanswered question, a question I don't know the answer to. Actually, I have 3 questions, but I think I know the answer to the first 2. But before I can get to any of them, I have to give you the context for them. We're probably all familiar with 2 different types of creativity, one personal and one impersonal. An example of personal creativity is Beethoven and his Eroica Symphony. The symphony is unique. It's a work of art that Beethoven created, and as a personal creation, nobody except Beethoven could possibly have created it. An example of impersonal creativity is Albert Einstein and his theory of relativity. The theory is also unique, like the Eroica Symphony, but unlike the symphony, it was not created, but discovered. Because what was discovered was something that existed out in the world. If Einstein hadn't discovered it, it could have been discovered by others. And in fact, it not only could have been, it would have been. Einstein was only half a generation ahead of others. Max Planck with Planck's constant was already knocking on the door, as was Konrad Lorenz with what is known as the Lorentz equation. Now let's add Loney and his book to the mix. The first of my 3 questions is Shakespeare identified more like a work of art or a scientific theory? My answer is that it's more like a work of art or a work of literature. It's unique. Nobody else could have written the book the way that Loney did. The second question concerns the idea of Oxford's authorship. Was that idea created or discovered? Those of us who believe that Oxford was Shakespeare will say that that fact existed out in the world and that Loney discovered it, not created it. Of course, Stratfordians might have a different answer. And now the third question, the one I don't know the answer to. Down here in green, if Loney hadn't discovered Oxford's authorship, would anybody else have discovered it? Before you jump to an answer, recall just how deeply his authorship had been hidden and consider just how severely Oxford himself had been erased from history. So I leave you with the open question of whether we today would know of Edward de Vere's authorship of Shakespeare's works if John Thomas Looney hadn't discovered it. Thank you very much.
Questions for Jim?
I thought that was great when you talked about why did Oxford hide his authorship, because I'm preparing for a podcast and we're talking about how history gets corrupted when you misidentify Shakespeare. And I tend to, you may have noticed I'm a talker, and when I'm flying or whatever, if I'm next to a younger person, I'm, like your friendly Jehovah's Witness, I try to rope them into Oxford. And invariably, when they're interested, because they'll be interviewing me, I let them do that, they will ask me really early into the conversation, why did he hide his identity? I think that is, and I've been telling my group, that seems to be one of the most important questions that we need to answer for the younger people who might start joining our group.
Just a quick question. Do we know, did Loney have was it a challenge to find a publisher for this, or did he already have a publisher lined up when he started his research, or what was can you tell a little bit about the history of the publication?
Yeah, he apparently had at least one other publisher willing to publish the book, but they insisted that he adopt a pseudonym. and hide his real last name. He refused to go along with that, but Cecil Palmer was willing to publish the book under his real name and ended up publishing, I think, another 13 books on the Oxfordian idea over the next decade. Okay, the question is, should it be pronounced Looney or Loney? The standard accepted pronunciation in the United States is Loney. And you see that spelled out with, with L-O-N-E-Y with a mark indicating a long O. And I saw that just twice more in recent publications. So Loney has been established for decades as the correct pronunciation in the United States. However, Loney's grandson and his family, Catherine Sharp found out, pronounced the name Looney. Yeah, with pride. Yes, with pride. For a while, I tried to adapt to Looney, but Loney is so deeply ingrained in my thinking that if I don't stop to think about it, I just automatically say Loney.
Really great talk, Jim. The first thing I want to say is the Stratfordian response to anything that challenges the idea of Shakespeare hasn't changed in 100 years. It's completely off the wall, vicious, furious, and often 100% fabricated. I recently went through this on a letter to the editor I wrote, and I feel perfectly comfortable in saying that they lie. One of the things you identified here is something I've thought that needs to be explored more, and that is the question of the creative process. Stratfordian research is basically trying to twist a very limited amount of yarn into an ever frayed coat. The question is, how does someone become so creative that they can produce what Oxford produced, hiding or not, in three significant forms: the plays, the poems, and the sonnets. And I think understanding the creative process would be very helpful to us. And the other thing is developing a real answer to the question of why hide, that is in effect standard, that if we can all agree on what that is, and getting it to the point of some bullets, a bulleted presentation, I think would be helpful, because after 100 years, that remains a very valid question. Why did he hide? And I think we have to have a complex and reasonable answer. But thank you very much for your work. It's very, very helpful.
Well, Bob, let me add a comment to each of your 2 points. On the first point about the nature of creativity, Charles Beauclerk once said that if you get Shakespeare wrong, you get the entire Elizabethan era wrong. We could say that if you get Shakespeare wrong, you get the entire creative process wrong, because eventually you're reduced to claiming that Shakespeare was a mere idiot savant who knew all these things and had deep insights to human nature, not because of his experiences in his life, but because he was just a genius who imagined them all. And that's not the way the human mind works. On the second point, which was... Oh, right. Why hide? Yeah. Well, I think if you ask, different people, you get different answers. And that's one of the problems with the persuasiveness of our message, is that we haven't come up with one unified answer. The Stratfordians have been able to do that by gliding over a lot of facts they don't want to acknowledge. And we're truth seekers, so we can't do that. And it's commendable that we have a lot of different opinions, and it would be great if we could have a brainstorming session at one of these conferences to try to sort through those. The clash of ideas is what we need, and we need sessions that are real brainstorming sessions to work out the answers to these most difficult questions and to decide on the strategies that we're going to use to to turn academia or to push academia to objectively and fairly examine the issue. We're not asking them to accept Oxford's authorship. We want an objective academic examination of the issue, and that's what we've never had in 100 years. By the way, this binder with 354 Oxfordian articles from 1930 to 1936, I will leave on the table over there if you want to see just how similar the issues being discussed here were to the issues being discussed today. You can look through here and you'll be amazed at the similarity between the issues then and now.
Just to follow up, to your knowledge, has anybody ever found out how many or the percentage of pseudonyms used in literature?
No, but someone once commented, academics who've studied this said that the Elizabethan era was the golden age of pseudonyms. So it wasn't just one person, Oxford, using it. It was because of the nature of the political situation there, pseudonyms were used by many, many people.
I'm just happy to find out that J. Thomas Looney was not a pseudonym for Winston Churchill's wife. But I have a serious comment. There was a quarterly publication put out by the Stratford Festival that was on the board of which Percy Allen sat, and through him he arranged that there would be a anti-Stratfordian article in each of the quarterly editions. If you think that would be helpful, I have them all scanned.
I'm not aware of the quarterly publication, but there was a monthly publication called the Shakespeare Pictorial, which had an Oxfordian page.
Well, that's it. Then
Okay.
I have them all scanned if you'd like.
I do too. I have the entire packet, which I'd be willing to share with anyone who wants it. I have it in PDF format, broken into 2 files because it's so thick. And in fact, all those articles for these 7 years are printed out and in this binder along with all the others. I'm actually working on a book, which I'll tell you about in the next session, in the panel discussion, which focuses on the events leading up to the 100th year anniversary of Shakespeare Identified.
Yeah, just one more thing on the pseudonym. In the debate between Alexander Waugh and Jonathan Bate, Tony pointed out that Shakespeare would have used a pseudonym, and would Bate agree to that? And he reluctantly did.
Well, that's right. Shakespeare is a pseudonym regardless of who the author was, because the guy from Stratford was named Wilhelm Shakespeare.
Hey, James, thanks so much for your research. It's just fantastic. And my question is, have you found any connection between Henry Folger and Emily, who were going back and forth to England all the time buying Shakespeare things for their library, which I think opened in 1931, something like that? Doesn't it seem likely that Henry Folger would have read the book or tried to find about this Loney or communicated in some way about Shakespeare being identified? He was building a library in his honor.
That's a very interesting question. I haven't found any evidence that Folger actually read Loney's book. However, Esther Singleton wrote a novel in which she goes back in time and visits Shakespeare's characters in their home territory, and she put Edward de Vere into 2 of the chapters in that book. 2 of Shakespeare's characters recite Edward de Vere's poetry and have life experiences that are the same as Edward de Vere's. Henry Folger was so taken with that novel that he bought dozens of copies and distributed them to his friends. He was in the process of negotiating the rights to buy the book from Esther Singleton, but then unfortunately he and she both died within a few months. He died just before the Folger was opened in Washington. However, her family donated the manuscript to the Folger Library, so it's there for anyone who wants to see it. And I'm actually in the process of preparing a new edition of that book with all of the references to Edward de Vere annotated. It'll come out in the spring. Esther Singleton, yes.
Yeah, just very briefly on that point, there have been 2 Orthodox books recently about Folger and his search for manuscripts, and both of those, one or at least the books, mentions that Folger was a member of the Bacon Society. So he was at one time either a Baconian or flirting with Baconianism. And it's interesting that he did collect into the library a lot of authorship Dow literature. So I'd be surprised if they didn't have a copy, first edition copy of the Looney's book in the Folger, because they have all the other authorship Dow. And there was a letter that Folger wrote toward the end of his life, quoted in one of these books. One was by Grant, and then there's another one by a woman. They both came out just about 2 years ago for the centennial, or the 400th anniversary of the death of Shakespeare. And in a letter, Folger said that he was no longer taken with the Baconian theory, so directly implying that he was taken with it. And the letter didn't specify whether he was disenchanted with Baconianism because he was returning to Stratfordianism, or maybe because he was getting interested in Oxfordianism, but then he died. I've heard that his wife was an Orthodox Stratfordian, but Henry Folger may well have been a doubter, possibly even an Oxfordian.
Well, Brian, that raises an interesting point. Someone who's a reader at the Folger might want to go back and look at the Folger's records to see the dates on which it acquired Oxfordian books. How long have they actually been in the library? It could be even before, they could have been there from the time the library opened, just after Folger himself died.